probably get started, I reckon. I'm going to start with a word of prayer. What did he tell me? His grandfather was that just passed away. Fish's grandfather. What's Fish's name, Greg?
His grandpa's name was Kearns.
Kearns, yes. Kearns family. I just couldn't think of it. So we'll pray for them as we get started as well. I think he said Belfont. I think that's where he was going with the Belfont. So we'll pray for the Kearns family. Also for our time. Lord, I ask your blessing as we open up your word tonight. I just pray that you might be glorified, that your people might be able to study and know more about you based on our discussion tonight. And so I ask that you might move among us and help us to learn. In Jesus I pray. Amen. So we're going to tackle the Gospels tonight, just the four Gospels. We're not going to get all the way through them. We're going to get through part of them a little bit. But my plan is just to kind of slow down when we get to the Gospels and go through the life and ministry of Jesus. But I want to give you an overview of those Gospels before we get to what's recorded for us. And so that's my goal. You might get me sidetracked from time to time, and if you do, it's your fault. All right. So, all right.
Where's Margaret at when we're really neighbors?
I know. When Margaret's here, we can really go. So you're going to see this particular starting slide. You're going to see it a bunch because it's probably going to take us several weeks to get through. I hope that we get through all the material I started tonight, and maybe that'll be a good measuring rod for how to move forward. But we can slow down at any point and just start having a conversation about it because we're not in any time frame here. So. All right, so let's start with this. Oh man, sorry. Now I got to go backwards through it. If you catch a glimpse real quick, you'll catch them all. You'll know where I'm going, but you got to be quick. How quick are you? How quick? All right. All right.
Any test questions on that?
Yes, we'll have. Go ahead and turn your papers over and begin. Any questions on the? Last time I went through a presentation very quick like that, somebody's like, "Hey, that's going to cause seizures, so be careful," because it does move in and out very quickly. All right, so here we go. The Gospels, I would tell you, obviously you all know maybe I'm not going to take anything for granted. Collection of the four books located at the beginning of the New Testament. It tells us 90% or more about what we know about Jesus. So when you think about the importance of the Gospels to our faith, 90% or better of what we know about the man who not just changed the world, but actually changed the way we keep time. I always talk about the significance of Jesus in that even if people don't want to believe that he is the Son of God, you must believe he did something very significant because we date our lives by his birth. And not just us, but people who don't even believe in Jesus. Every time they sign a check, every time they write the date, it is based on a belief in this guy named Jesus. So what he did is pretty significant. And 90% of what we know about him or more comes from just these four books. So we're going to spend our time going through these four books. So they were written by men who either walked with Jesus, and here's an important thing, or investigated the eyewitnesses of the life and ministry of Jesus. They're written specifically with an audience in mind. We'll talk about those audiences tonight a little bit. But the authors are important. It's important to know a little bit about their background and then who they wrote, who their target audience was. It's also important to know who the target audience is so that you can pick up on some of the little nuances throughout the gospel. The Bible is fun to study the more you study it. You pick up little things here and there, and it just adds a new meaning to something. And so I hope this will provide you with a little bit of background on that. So let's grab the authors first. Of course, the Gospels are named after their authors, believed to be authors. I'll maybe describe some of that. So John, that we're talking about, is the Apostle John. He also wrote 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, and I believe that he wrote the book of Revelation as well. I think most people do, but that's John's contributions to the Bible. Matthew was also an apostle, also called Levi. Well, it's not called the book of Levi, it's called the book of Matthew, but Matthew bears both names, Matthew and Levi. From time to time he'll refer to himself, but not very often. Luke, who was a personal companion of the Apostle Paul, he was a physician who investigated these matters. If you remember, we looked at Luke's opening statement in Luke chapter 1, where he said, I put together an orderly account of the things that had transpired. And so that's Luke's goal. He also wrote the book of Acts as well. And then Mark is believed to be, John Mark, who would have been an early disciple of Jesus, but most likely followed the Apostle Peter. And I'll give you some reasons why I believe that when we get to Mark's Gospel, that he followed the Apostle Peter and wrote down much of Peter's sermons. That much of what we read in the book of Mark could very well be Peter's sermons, and that's why there's, I don't get too far ahead of myself. So, anyway, that's mostly why they're named that way, is after their authors. You'll see at the beginning, which is not, let me repeat, not in the biblical text, is a heading at the beginning of your book that says, the Gospel according to Matthew. That was not in the original text, although Matthew was added just a little bit. It was very close after Matthew would have passed away. It would have been put there. So let's go. I want to go through these in kind of a different order. We're going to look at the Gospel of John first, just because it's my favorite. So if you want to go in a different order, you should pick your favorite. Right? You can start teaching. But according to these three different historical theologians, Westcott, Morris, and Bloomberg, there are 5 points to establish that John, the son of Zebedee, is the author of the Gospel of John. So if you remember, who was John's brother? There are two sons of Zebedee. James and John. Did you say James? Sorry, I didn't hear on that side. So James and John were called the sons of Zebedee, also known as Sons of Thunder. Extra credit if you can give me the other name they were known by. Anyone? Boangers. You would have never gotten that one because it means Sons of Thunder. But so James and John were called the Sons of Thunder. Here are the reasons why it is believed or at least 5 reasons or 5 steps to kind of get to how John wrote it. First of all, if you read it, you can't deny that there's a Jew who actually wrote it. So that's going to start to narrow down the people who are capable of writing the Gospel of John, historically speaking. So he was a Jew who was very familiar with Palestine. Much of John's Gospel takes place in that area. He gives cities and names of certain areas in his Gospel that you would have had to have been familiar with the area to know. So if somebody's not familiar with our area, they might say that Raceland and Russell and Wortland and Worthington are all the same area. And they're all different, right? Weird people live in each one of those spots, right? So if you approach somebody and said you're from, you must be from Worthington, and they're actually from Wortland, what kind of response would you get? Well, maybe Russell, Raceland. So if I accuse Greg of living in Russell, that's right. You pay the higher taxes, right? That's what I would tell you, is you pay higher. Well, so you would have to be from this area to know those little nuances, right? Like if I just told you, my wife graduated from Lewis County High School, and she's back there going, well, I went to Tollsboro though. You would need to know those nuances. Well, John knows all those little nuances, or whoever wrote the Gospel of John, which I believe to be John, was from the Palestinian area. He knows those little nuances, and he uses those in his Gospel. We don't pick up on that, but there's little things, like in John chapter 6, for instance, that story takes place. John inserts, this happened at the synagogue of Capernaum. It's just inserted. From time to time, you'll see what's called a parenthetical statement in the Gospel of John, and it's just inserted. John just adds a little jab, and it's because he understood that area and what the readers would have needed to know. It was also written by an eyewitness. From time to time, he gives details that only a person who would have been there would have possibly recalled or remembered, and then He does. We do identify him later as one of the apostles, one of the 12, and then of course that leads us to believe it's the Apostle John. He's called the beloved disciple, but he never really describes himself in the text, which is not uncommon for writers of that day. Paul will say, I, Paul, and then he writes his letters, usually. Paul doesn't, with the exception of one line in the book of Colossians, I think, Paul doesn't write anything. Paul has a scribe. There's a line in Colossians where Paul says, I myself, sign this basically, look what big letters I am writing with. Paul is believed to have really terrible eyesight. His letters would have been big. So Paul would have spoken and somebody would have dictated what Paul spoke. They would have written what Paul told them to write. So Paul really didn't write anything. But the Gospel of John, we believe the book of Revelation was actually written by the pen of John himself. So this is their estimate of how you can get to the Apostle John being the author of that specific gospel without naming himself. Matthew's is a little different to kind of get to. Each of these Gospels come to us, how we find out their authors come a little bit differently each time. So early church tradition, in other words, men who were born recently after the apostles, like this guy named Papias, not what you write on, but the man. He's the one who attributed the writing of the Gospel of Matthew to a guy called Levi, who identifies himself as Matthew in Matthew's Gospel and in the Gospel of Luke as well. And so what we know is that the author certainly knew intimate details that could have hurt the reputation of the apostles and included them anyway. If this were a person who wasn't an eyewitness, let's do the Matthew one, because it's a really important one. So Matthew chapter 16, verses 21 through 23, and hopefully I can give you a picture as to what I mean by damaging material that he left in. So Matthew chapter 16, verses 21 through 23.
From that time Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, Far be it from you, Lord, that this shall never happen to you. But he turned and said to Peter, Get behind me, Satan. You are a hindrance to me, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man.
So why did Matthew keep that?
It added credibility.
Yeah, it's just true, right? It's what happened. And so why would he not include what was there? Why would this be hurtful to include it in the story?
It's embarrassing.
It is. I mean, the guy goes from being blessed to cursed in like two sentences, right? So he goes from, Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has revealed this to you, to Get behind me, Satan. It's all in the same paragraph. I mean, that's kind of a harsh turnaround, right? So, and if you notice, I want to dig in a little bit to that when we get into Matthew's Gospel specifically. But there is something that Matthew includes here that you need to grab. And that is, even late in the ministry of Jesus, the apostles still did not understand the role of the Messiah. That late in the ministry of Jesus, they still didn't understand fully what the Messiah was supposed to look like and what he was supposed to do. Matthew's gospel is built on the concept of the Jewish Messiah. And so 3 years into the ministry of Jesus, walking with Jesus for almost a 3-year period, and Peter and the rest of the apostles were told when they confessed Jesus to be the Christ, he said, don't tell anybody. Why would he tell them not to tell anybody? Well, it wasn't time yet. But they didn't know what they were talking about. Because Jesus then says, here's going to be the role of the Messiah. And Peter's response is, may it never be. You're not allowed to go die. I'll fight and die for you, but you're not allowed to go and die. You're the Messiah. And that's why Jesus was telling them, don't tell anybody that I'm the Messiah, because you don't understand the role of the Messiah. And so Matthew picks that up, and it's going to be a theme throughout. So many of the Jewish leaders of that day if the guys who walked with Jesus every day didn't understand the role of the Messiah, how could you expect the Jewish leadership, who only got to interact with him very seldomly, to understand that role? So Matthew could have taken those things out, but he didn't. He left them in there because it's part of the narrative of his story. It does, as Charlie talked about, lends credibility to Matthew's writing. But we also know that he was an eyewitness, even though that could have hurt. So it's kind of like what John does with Judas. Every time John introduces Judas Iscariot, he says, the one who would betray him. Like, he could have done that early. He would say, well, this is Judas, the guy who betrayed Jesus. And then later he could just say it was Judas, but he didn't. Every time Judas is found in the Gospel of John, he is the dude that betrayed Jesus. Every time. It's remarkable. So Matthew could have left these out, but he decided not to. Matthew is certainly an educated man. He knew the Old Testament law really well. So we get to Luke. Luke is the easiest to identify because Luke basically tells us up front who he's writing to. If you go to, well, we won't do Luke chapter 1 just yet, but if somebody would go to Colossians chapter 4 and read verse 14, I'm going to get to that in just a minute. So Luke's gospel is the easiest to identify by the way he begins it, but you have to do some thinking. I try to tell people all the time, if you don't want to think, like if you want a religion that doesn't require you to think, you need to pick something other than Christianity. Because God requires us to use our brain. So, who did Luke write to again?
Theophilus.
Yes. Luke chapter 1, he writes to Theophilus. In Acts chapter 1, he is writing to the same dude. Okay? So we'll just call him Theo for now. Late in the book of Acts, Luke switches from this to this. So what's he telling us?
He was there.
Yes. So yeah. So for this part of the first I don't know if it's 16 chapters, 17 chapters, it's exactly what he does in Luke's gospel. He investigates. He asks eyewitnesses. He gets information. He writes about it. From this point on, he's no longer an investigator. He's a participator, right? He's in the story himself. And so Colossians chapter 4 identifies Luke, if somebody has that on Luke 4:14, as being a brother or companion to the Apostle Paul during this time period. Anybody got it?
Our dear friend Luke, the doctor, and Demas send greetings.
So, let me just ask you, how good of a doctor was Luke? We don't know, but evidently a bad one. Paul had a thorn in the flesh that he never could get rid of, even though he's got his own personal physician traveling with him. Timothy, poor Timothy, had to take a little wine for his stomach's sake. He's traveling around with the doctor because he did travel with Timothy quite some time. And he could never fix his stomach. So the only two people we know he came in contact with who were sick never got better. So he had to
HMO.
yeah, he wasn't getting paid as a doctor, I tell you that. So he went to that's probably why he's a writer. Those who do, and those who can't. John and Tiffany, sorry, I didn't want to bring that up, right? So Luke becomes an instructor of sorts and starts writing. His is the easiest one to tell because all you got to do is put the dots together, and you can tell that Luke is the author of both Luke and Acts. And then Mark's a little different to figure out how we get Mark as the author. It's believed to be John Mark, the guy. Some believe he is the young man who fled naked through the city of Jerusalem after being accused of being with Jesus. It's just a weird story in the Gospel. Mark never identifies himself. But based on some internal evidence, Christian tradition, historically speaking, there are reasons to believe that John Mark is the author of this. First of all, Mark makes no claim to be an eyewitness. So Mark never claims that he saw these things. So he investigated these things that he saw. It's believed that he traveled with the Apostle Peter. We kind of know that through some of Paul's writings. And Mark's gospel has no order to it. It would be as if I sat down and wrote a gospel. Like, I am not like this orderly person, A, B, C, D, this happened January 1st, this happened. There's no order in Mark's gospel. The theory here is that Mark was writing down the preaching of Peter. And that's how we end up with the gospel of Mark. He just writes it out, and Peter is not, when you think preacher, please don't think what I do every Sunday morning. That wasn't really what Peter did. Peter did preach, but he wasn't in the pulpit every week. That's not their style of preaching. They were much more teachers than what we would consider to be preachers. So Mark would be listening to the stories told by the Apostle Peter. That's how we end up with that gospel. It is believed, though, that Mark is the earliest of the gospel writers, that he wrote first. And it would make sense because Peter's dead by 63, I think, or 64 AD. I think he's killed fairly. He's definitely killed before the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. And so it's believed that this is the earliest of those gospels.
Now, this is not the same one that Paul and Barnabas took.
Yeah, I believe so. I believe
Is
it's
it?
the same John
Okay.
Mark. Yeah,
Okay.
that they split over and fought over and that kind of stuff.
Okay.
I believe he's the same dude.
Same guy.
Yeah, young guy. He would have been young, which we know that they took young people with them. But for me, what's more important though is to understand who the intended audience is. So you don't even need to know who wrote it, but who they're writing to, because it does kind of change the way you read the text. So, while it's almost impossible to say with accuracy, with 100% accuracy, who they're actually writing to, there's some clues that you can identify who the audience might be. Now, let me say this. By extension, we are all the audience of the gospel. But they wrote to an initial audience, and that's why there are certain things found within them that we don't understand. Like, we've got to go dig around to understand. So, like in John's gospel, for instance, when he says this took place at the synagogue of Capernaum, do you know why he includes that in there? You got to do a lot of research to figure out why he includes the synagogue of Capernaum there. Here's my understanding. It's what I was able to find out as I've studied this many, many times because I love the Gospel of John. I mean, it's just my favorite book. Gospel of John's my favorite gospel. The synagogue of Capernaum had archaeologists tell us, had a picture on the is it called the lintel? Is that what you walk in? Is that the thing that's above the door? It's called the lintel of the doorpost. They had an engraving in their synagogue, and it was an engraving of the single greatest miracle in the Old Testament. Any guesses as to what the Jews believed to be the greatest miracle in the Old Testament? The manna in the wilderness was the single great, because think about it, every day you get up and you've got food waiting on you. Well, what more could you ask for, right? And they still complain. What is this stuff, right? So, does anybody know the miracle that took place in John chapter 5? And then the story that takes place in John chapter 6. The synagogue of Capernaum plays a big part in that. It was the feeding of the 5,000. And then the crowd started following him. And Jesus said, "You're following me because you think I'm going to feed you every day. But I tell you, unless you eat on the flesh of the Son of Man and drink of his blood, you have no life in you." And he's not talking about communion there. He's talking about feeding on him daily, because that's the image that's there. And then John adds, so that the person who reads it for the first time knows, these things he said in the synagogue of Capernaum. And when they read that, they're like, "Oh man, I bet he really burned their bottom." Because right above where he would have said this would have been a picture of manna in the wilderness. He was saying to them very loudly, "You all don't even know your own history. You're going to need to feed on this every single day." That's the imagery there. But we have to study that out in order to know those things. The original audience would have been like, "Wow, he really zinged them, didn't he?" Now we got to read it and you look at me like, "Yeah, that's kind of neat, but I don't really get the zing." I was like, I don't care if you get it or not. But there is an intentional audience to each of these Gospels. And so we'll start with Matthew. According to Carson and Moon, who wrote a very, very good detailed introduction to the New Testament, Matthew wrote his gospel with a certain kind of reader in mind. Have you ever read a book that you know was for just a certain group of people? I have a book in, I think in electronic form now, called, what's it called? Oh gosh. Esther Meeks wrote it, and it's called Covenant Epistemology. It's about 350 pages worth of typewriter maintenance manual type writing. It is terrible. We can cut that out later if we want, but it has words in there. Tracy was watching me, I think, type something out of that book, and she said, "That's not a word," because I can't spell very good. And so I look back at the book, and that's the word. She makes up her own words, and they're all this long. They have like 25 syllables in them. It's just a terrible read. And it's written for a certain type of audience. Have you ever read those books that are educational in nature, and you're like, man, this is hard to read? And then you pick up something that's an easy read like Dr. Seuss, and you're like, oh, I got this, right? I'm good. I get this, right? I don't understand that. So
Pictures are important.
pictures are really important.
Yeah, there you
Mentioned
go.
that the other day, right? So I'm going to pick on well, you two are the only guys on the board at the time when I first got here anyway. So I'm going to pick on our guys for a minute. We read a book when I first got here called My Iceberg is Melting, or Our Iceberg is Melting. It's 98 pages. The font is like this big, and it's got 60 pages of pictures. Is that fair? Yeah. And so everybody reads this book. They love the book. It is a really good book, by the way. It is a really good book. And everybody's like, wow, this is great. And then the next book I had us read was Spirituality and Leadership, I think, that had one chart in it somewhere, and the font's like this big, and it's a little heavier theology. And they were like, labored through that book. So you get that there are books written for different audiences, and you want to make sure that you get the right audience. So Matthew is writing with a specific reader in mind. He's writing to those people who have a Jewish mindset. And here's how you know that. He references a lot of Jewish themes. He draws heavily on Jewish concepts of the Messiah and eschatology. Don't be afraid of that word. Eschatology just means end times. But when I say end times, what do you all think? Revelation, right? When Jews living in the time of Matthew would have heard the word eschatology or end times, they would have thought Messiah. They did not think second coming. They thought Messiah. So it makes more sense at the end of Matthew's gospel in Matthew chapter 24 when they say, tell us, when will these things be? When will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? Which most people read and they think he's talking about, end times like Revelation type stuff, and Jesus isn't talking about that at all. So in Matthew's gospel, what he is doing is laying that foundation of what to expect for the Messiah. That's why when you read in chapter 16, when Jesus says, don't tell anybody, that's part of Matthew's plan as he is writing this story, is to let you know that what you thought the Messiah was going to look like is not what the Messiah is going to look like. And so he has that audience in mind. He plays heavily on that. Also, given these characteristics, it appears that Matthew is focused on just not an entirely Jewish audience, but if you're not a Jewish audience, you have to study a lot to figure that out. You have to really dig into the text. But if you were a Jew living during the time of Matthew, you pick it up, you read it, and you're like, oh, wow, I get that. So when you hear the gates of hell shall not prevail, you're Peter, and on this rock I'll build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. What do you think about the gates of hell? You probably taught this a couple weeks ago. You've been in Pete's class. Be quiet. But when you hear me say the gates of hell, what do you think I'm talking about?
That's my guess.
Well, we got two good guesses back there. I always, I've said this before, I think a little bit about the gates at the Columbus airport. Because technically it is Gehenna there, and that's a whole other, we'll talk about that maybe another time.
You can't get back out.
Okay, so Jesus used that quote at Caesarea Philippi, where there was literally a place called the gates of hell that were right there. It was a place of satanic worship, if I'm not mistaken. It was a deep cave that rumored to have a pit that you couldn't find the bottom of, had steam that came up out of it all the time. But the thing that I believe that Jesus is pointing to, people might disagree on this, but you can correct me now or later. The thing that I think that Jesus is pointing to is there were constantly orgies taking place at the gates of hell, or the gates of Hades. There was a lifestyle of vulgarity that was there. And Jesus said, I tell you, you are Peter, and upon this rock I'll build my church, and this stuff will not prevail against it. So there's a different meaning to that specific text. Now, does it mean that Satan's not going to conquer the church? Absolutely. But what he's pointing at specifically is this lifestyle that's there, this worship that's taking place here. We've got to study that to get it. His audience would have picked that up and went, oh yeah, man, that would have been, I wish I was there when Jesus said that, take that, you gates of hell. That's kind
And
of
Paul had to go on and teach that to the Gentiles later on.
Yes. Yeah, and so to a Gentile audience, there's a lot more detailed writing about Jewish themes, right? So Matthew is writing in a way where he assumes his reader already knows those Jewish themes. That's why we assume that Matthew's writing to a much more Jewish audience. The focus of his writing is more Jewish. We still get a lot out of it. We just got to work harder at it. That's all. All right. We get to Mark's gospel. Mark is written a little bit different with a little different focus. When you wonder why there are three gospels that are very much alike, but they tell things differently, this is why they're there. It's highly likely that his audience was non-Jewish because, and here's some of the reasons, he takes time to explain some Jewish traditions. So I don't know if I included this in there, but these rituals down here, these Mosaic law rituals, sometimes he will explain that they washed their hands and why they washed their hands. Okay, he'll say things like, it was a tradition of the elders to do this. Whereas if you were a Jewish audience, you would already know that. But when we read it, we're like, well, why in the world are they so worried about cleaning the cup, the outside of the bowl? Well, why would they be so worried about cleaning the outside of the bowl? You can't eat with a dirty bowl. That's part of their rituals. You got to clean the bowl. That's why that great big laver's right out there in front of the temple. You got to get clean before you can go in.
And you don't have a good doctor.
And you don't have a good doctor, right? Here's what's funny. They never clean the inside of the bowl. What you actually eat out of. And that's the illustration that we see Jesus using. Like, you're so worried about the outside of the bowl, but you never clean the inside.
Well, you're making a good impression too, if you got to clean outside.
Yeah, if you got to clean outside, people are like, wow, man, they must have really cleaned their house, right? And don't look inside the bowl, right? Don't look in the bowl. There's my little mold down in there. There's some other stuff.
I worked with a gentleman that never cleaned his coffee cup.
I don't either,
because he felt that that's where a lot of the flavor came from with his coffee.
It does, yeah, it coats it.
And I didn't see anything wrong with that rationale myself.
It is, right?
Yeah.
I clean mine when if I leave coffee in it and it gets mold on top, and I was like, I gotta clean it. When's the last time you cleaned that crock? That's an Andy Griffith quote. Sorry, I had to work that one in. All right, so Mark does something else that's kind of odd if he were writing to more of a Jewish audience. He takes Aramaic language and actually, or he translates those Aramaic statements. Jesus would have spoken fluently Hebrew and Aramaic and Greek. Most people in his day were bilingual, at least, and they would have learned the Aramaic language growing up. So, Mark takes the Aramaic and translates it from time to time because his audience maybe didn't understand the Aramaic language as well. So there's some indication inside the text that happens. He expresses the cessation of or getting rid of some of the Mosaic rituals, if not the Mosaic law itself. Would have never done that to a Jewish audience. How does Matthew approach that? Jesus said, I did not come to destroy the law, but to fulfill it. Jesus, in Matthew's gospel, is always shown as honoring and respecting the law. Mark doesn't spend that much time even discussing the law. He just says, Jesus did this. That's just the way it is. So his audience wouldn't have cared that much about some of the background. It's also some of the other language that would indicate that it's geared more towards a Christian audience that's not Jewish in background, more Roman, is the political language that Mark uses. I already mentioned this earlier. The word gospel is a politically charged word. It was a Roman word that had all kinds of political connotations. I think what did I use, the Make America Great Again hat? Like, that's got a political connotation to it, right? Well, the word gospel, before Mark writes in Mark chapter 1, this is the gospel, this is the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Before he wrote that, the word gospel had a very deep political meaning to a Roman audience. And so he says something up front that if you don't know that background, you would miss it. And then Luke specifically gives us his audience. Who is Luke's audience? Good old Theo, right? Theophilus, which we said, you remember what we said the word Theophilus meant? There's a great debate. Man, you all.
Like the body of believers.
Would you say that test was coming out? All right. Somebody spell Theophilus for me.
Common spell.
T-H-E-O.
T-H-E-O. I think it's
P-H-I-L-U-S.
L-U-S.
M-O-U-S-E.
P-I-E-I-O.
What do you want to hear?
So, Theophilus is a compound word. It's made up of two words. This word Theo is the Greek word for God. Phileos is the Greek word for, it's the same place we get brotherly love. Philadelphia, that's how Philadelphia gets its name, brotherly love. It comes from this word, Phileos. It just means love. Okay? So, please don't do, I did this the other day in class, and this girl goes, God love. I said, who's the book written to? She's like, God love.
Lovers of God.
There you go. Theophilus means lovers of God. So, is he writing to a specific person named Theophilus? Maybe, because he says most excellent. It's a title. But more likely than not, he's writing to, you mentioned it earlier, the general population at large, the body of believers, those who love God. So he's not writing specifically to an audience that is connected through Jewish heritage. So that's why you pick up little clues that it's more of a Gentile body. He starts with some secular history. He doesn't go back to Abraham. He starts with some secular history. He starts with Herod. He starts with there's all sorts of little Roman rulers. There's a little word called tetrarch that's found only in Luke's gospel. It's a Roman official. It was a not very commonly used name that was given to officials. It's actually one of the things that was used to discredit Luke's writing was that word tetrarch. It was never used in Greek history until, I don't know, sometime in the late 60s, 1960s, there was an archaeological dig that uncovered a plate that actually used the name Herod the Tetrarch, which is the exact phrase that Luke uses. And so archaeology eventually caught up to speed with the Bible. And so he uses that. He traces the ancestry of Jesus, not to Abraham or even through David per se, but to Adam. So why would Luke go all the way back to Adam? Any thoughts? Why didn't he just go to Abraham or David?
We all go
The beginning.
Everybody goes back to Adam.
To cover everybody.
Everybody goes back to Adam. Not everybody goes back to Abraham. But every tribe, every tongue, every nation goes back to Adam. So Luke sends his gospel speaking of the genealogy of Jesus through Adam, our common ancestor. So there's some indication there that he would do that. He sometimes omits certain phrases that would include things like uncleanliness, which, what does it mean to be unclean ceremonially? We don't have a frame of reference for that, do we? But Jewish audiences would. And so he doesn't include that in some of his writings because the people he's trying to reach wouldn't have really do what?
It's like wearing your hand.
That's an interesting one there. All right. Sometimes he will substitute titles for Jewish leaders so that they sound less Jewish to his audience. A title like rabbi, for instance, we're a fairly well-educated group of people, so we know what rabbi means, right? Well, his audience who doesn't have any inclinations towards Judaism, we'd read the word rabbi and they'd be like, what in the world's a rabbi? But so Luke would include things like leader, they understood what a leader was, or Lord, they understood what kurios meant. He would insert things like ruler, as opposed to putting, like, he was a ruler of the synagogue, instead of saying he was a rabbi. That's what Luke does, because his audience may not have necessarily understood that. And then that gets us to John. John's purpose, John's the only one that clearly defines his purpose, but man, he makes you wait till the end to get it. But let's read it, because again, John's my favorite gospel, and I'm leading this here class, and I like it. John is really clear, though, about his purpose for writing. So somebody has that, John chapter 20, verses 30 and 31. And then tell me why John wrote.
Now Jesus did many other many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name.
So why is John writing? I used to say John's writing so that you could believe that Jesus is the Christ. That's just the means to the end as to why John's writing.
He's writing so you'll have everlasting life.
Yes. His purpose for writing is so that we might have everlasting life. The only way to have everlasting life is that we believe in Jesus as the Christ. The only way to do that really is to read through this book. That's the purpose for me writing. So that you would read this, you would believe it, and you would get the benefit of believing that, which is you could have everlasting life. And John uses that theme of belief continually. Think back to the most popular verse in the world. Well, second most popular verse in the world, John 3:16. For God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him. Now, when we go back and parse that a little bit later, he's talking to a Jew who would not have had any problems believing in the resurrection of Jesus. He wouldn't have any problems believing in the crucifixion of Jesus. He wouldn't have any problems believing in, he wouldn't have any problems being baptized, which he mentions in the first part of John chapter 3. What he would have a hard time believing is that the guy sitting in front of him talking to him is the Messiah. And Jesus gives him that. It's in a personal conversation in which John 3:16 takes place. Don't divorce it of the rest of that conversation. You do that at your own peril. So, John appears to be approaching kind of a generic audience who may or may not have any Jewish background whatsoever. It's one of the reasons it's my favorite. He writes differently. I'll talk about the differences maybe next week. I don't know if we're going to get to it this week. John appears to address a controversy at the very beginning of his book. And that controversy is the deity of Jesus. Is this guy that we believe in God in the flesh? That's what John starts out by addressing from the very beginning. He says, in the beginning, which is a direct quote from the book of Genesis. And he says, in the beginning was. So already in existence. So before the world began, the Word was already there, right? So he starts by addressing that controversy, and he does a great job of it. Those first 18 or so verses of his gospel, which I devoted a full 18 lessons of 50 minutes to 1 year. So when Margaret talks about wanting me to teach the book of Revelation, I'm like, listen, I got to get through John's gospel first before we can do that. And it'll take me about 2 years to get through John's gospel at the pace that I teach. She's like, I don't know if I got 2 years. That's what she'd say. Like, oh. So you can imagine how long it take to get through the book of Revelation. It just takes me that long to get through John's gospel. But John writes, if you don't understand that Jesus is God in the flesh, you'll never understand all of John's book. And so and if you don't believe that, you'll stop reading right away. You just get, like, you start reading that, it's like, this can't be. And just close the book and move on, which is what some people do. And that's John's gospel. It's kind of written that way. And also, one of the reasons I like John's gospel is you see the very personal side of Jesus' ministry. It is so much different than the other three. So you will see the way in which Jesus interacts with people on a very personal level in all walks of life. So he'll interact with his mother. You'll see him interact with Lazarus. You see him interact with Lazarus' sisters. You see him interact with a Jewish leader named Nicodemus. You see him interact with the Jewish synagogue leaders in John chapter 9. He interacts with them all differently. You see him interact with the woman at the well, Samaritan, who had no right to even think about being related to Jewish people or even knowing who God was. And you see him interact with that person differently. With the blind man, he treats him differently than he does the blind man's parents. John's gospel is very eye-opening to the personality of Jesus, and I believe John intends it to kind of be that way. We probably should stop there. What time is it?
10 till.
10 till. We don't have enough. I can't do the entire synoptics in 10 minutes. So, are we okay with just stopping a little bit early? Nobody.
As long as we go 10 minutes late next time.
I'll try. All right. So, let's pick back up on the synoptic because I don't think I can do them justice in 10 minutes. Anybody got any questions about it? Well, just the introduction of the Gospels. Twice.
What was wrote first?
The first one written, I believe, Mark's Gospel.
Does it have any bearing?
Not really. It may have spurred Luke to write. Maybe Mark and Matthew may have spurred Luke to write a little bit. Maybe. But I don't. They're so similar. Their finer points are you got to really dig in to figure out. So, but I think tradition would tell us that Mark's gospel was written first, just because of the death of Peter, how quickly that came. But I'm open to being wrong about that.
It's an interesting young man, though. I mean, John Mark. I mean, he ran away, or that's the way I perceive it.
Twice.
Yeah, and yet here we are,
But
marveling over
his writing.
his writing.
But if tradition is true and he's recording Peter,
Yeah,
he's following around a guy who denied Jesus 3 times.
that's
And
true.
even cursed the young girl for trying to point out that he knew him. It's just an interesting combination of people, right?
It is.
Luke, who would have been the most educated writer of the Gospels, is traveling with Paul, who was by far the most educated of any of the other writers of the Bible. So I think it's interesting how God kind of puts those people together. Everybody left John alone. I mean, once you've been boiled in oil, people leave you alone pretty quick, you know. John was supposedly boiled in oil. So
Now he didn't have he was alone on the island, right? Pretty much. Is that how it goes?
that's what he was in exile on the Isle of Patmos when he writes. But he was in the Spirit on the Lord's day. So I don't know if I mentioned this last week here, if I mentioned it last week in class, but I have a high reverence for the book of Revelation, not because of what's there, but because of how we got it. Like somebody had to smuggle that book off the island at the risk of their own life. Somebody had to smuggle that thing into the 7 churches in Asia at the risk of their own life. To each of those churches, they had to copy it at risking their own life just to get the Word of God to people. I have a great deal of respect and reverence for how we got the Bible, just because of that. You will not turn a page of the Bible that there were not people killed to get it to you. It's very humbling to think, as we read
Well,
it.
just think about the modern day history of people trying to deliver pages of the Bible.
Yeah, or just small books.
Or
Yeah.
just small books, yeah.
Yeah, it's not very pretty. So, all right, any other questions? I didn't even get to show you this. This will be, you can marvel over this, one of my many collections, and then I'll show it to you next week. No peeking on that. So we'll keep it as a surprise. Did we pass a prayer sheet around?
I'm gonna get one from Amazon.
You've been staring at it. You've been staring at it the whole time, right? Don't,
Maybe
hey,
here tomorrow.
don't covet. That's a Bible thing. Don't covet.
Free shipping.
I got to cover it up and everything, and that thing's worth its weight in gold. It's really, but it's the new revised standard, so some people don't like it. So maybe you try to find it in the ESV or something. Might be better. So, did somebody pass a prayer list around? This is not Wednesday night.
Margaret wasn't here.
That's true. It's her fault if we're not.
Where are they?
I don't know. So we'll just
Your guess is as much.
take prayer requests then.
She's not here tomorrow.
Yeah, if she's not here in the morning, then you're going to look, right? It's like, she's not here tomorrow morning, we're gonna have to search.
She's gonna have that note on her. Told you, I should talk quicker.
Yeah, I know. Mm-hmm. Might be true. All right, so we'll just take them verbally, I guess. Any prayer requests for tonight?
Gary Coleman.
Say again.
Gary Coleman.
Yep. Pray for Gary. Did he come home today? But he did have a heart attack, right?
Supposed to have had a heart attack, had one vessel restented and then stent.
Anybody else?
Well, Jim Wilson.
Yeah.
I mean, if you follow it on Mandy on Facebook, he's at a resting point now, is the way I perceived it. He's waiting for insurance on one hand and he's waiting for his levels to go back up on the other hand. So. Which is good because, you don't have all that stuff you got to put up with. But it doesn't do anything to help you get rid of that stuff.
Yeah.
Stay home.
Virginia Russell.
Okay.
You know,
Yeah, and
Brenda's better.
Brenda as well.
Yeah, she,
Sarah Scott, Marty's daughter, was supposed to have back
Yes.
surgery.
Uh-huh.
How did that go? Has anybody heard?
I don't know the answer to that. I know.
I messaged him the other day, just seeing how he was doing. He didn't do much. He's watching her kids still. So.
'Cause she had the surgery at the hospital in North
I thought he said something about Knoxville.
Winston-Salem. What's the college at Winston-Salem?
Wake
Wake Forest. I think no, that's somebody else that went there for a cancer thing. She had it maybe in Knoxville, somewhere in Tennessee. Sorry, I'm getting my people mixed up.
Can we put her on the list then?
Anybody else?
well, Grayson, we talked to Barr today, he's somewhat better, but he'll be going to Cincinnati for an appointment there.
Okay.
Is Wendell getting better? Wendell Morris?
Yes.
Got his appointment went fine Tuesday. because they thought they may keep him Tuesday if it didn't go well, so I think it's doing better.
He's graduated.
He's at that point where I'm gonna get up and do something stupid.
Right.
You know, so
that might be our prayer.
we need to pray for him not to get up and do something stupid.
That might be the way we need to pray.
He's not as well as he thinks he is.
You got it on the,
Yeah.
He has
right there.
he's able to put weight on it, I know that.
Yeah.
And not full weight, but some weight. That's when it gets really dangerous.
That's for sure.
So what did he say? He was actually able to use his walker as a
As a walker.
as a
As a
walker,
walker, not a crutch.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
there he goes.
that's he'll be zooming around here, and he'll be yelling at him. So
Colton Griffin.
you want to continue to pray for Colton and that whole process for it to make its way.
Is Carolyn feeling better? Have we heard anything? She
Well,
was fighting pneumonia there.
yeah, but she's fighting it in Florida, so she's about 50 degrees warmer. So
Yeah,
we made
that's true.
Chris cut that off. It's not on her to see that, but yeah, I think she's doing better. Cut that out of the tape. Yeah, if she's gonna feel sick, you might as well do it in
Yeah.
80 degrees instead of 30 degrees, right? So, but the last conversation I had with her, she's doing better.
Okay.
She sounded better anyway. So, anybody else? Okay. Well, let's pray and then we'll head ahead home. Greg, you want to pray for us?
Father, we come to you just knowing that you're here and that you care. Father, we thank you for that. We thank you for your love. We thank you most of all for your Son. We thank you for this opportunity to study. We ask your blessings upon each and every person we mention. May people be healed. May they be touched by your presence. May we reach out and show your love to the best of our abilities. Again, be with Colton. We pray that, again, just keep him close to you. May, in all these situations, Lord, in sickness and health, and situations that are beyond our control, may we seek to honor you in the way we handle. Again, we thank you for each and every person here. May we leave this place and look for opportunities to serve you. In Jesus' name we pray.
Amen.